Hi, I'm Rachel Beyer. I'm the John W. Emery Family Assistant Curator of Oral History at History Colorado. Today I'm coming to you from my kitchen with a brand new program at History Colorado that we're calling the Historic Table. What is it, you ask? Well, it's one part cooking demo and one part deep dive into the archives, where we're going through our records to find recipes that have long histories here in the state of Colorado and deep connections to its people. The first dish that we're going to present to you on the historic table is the Cornish Pasty. What's a Cornish Pasty, you ask? Well, it's simply a piece of pie you can eat with your hands. That is, it's the filling completely surrounded by a crust. Now, today we think of the pasty as a pretty humble food. I mean, you can eat it with your hands while you're standing up. But it hasn't always been that way. In fact, it actually has its origins in royalty. So before it even made it to Colorado, before it even got to Cornwall, the pasty showed up around 800 years ago on the table of English lords and ladies who ate their pasties filled with succulent ingredients like venison, beef, lamb, or eel, with some sort of gravy kind of holding it all together. By the 1600s, so around 400 years ago, the Cornish tin miners and farmers out in Wales figured out that the pasty made a pretty good way to take your lunch to work with you and to be able to still keep working and eat your lunch at the same time. And thus the pasty moved from its royal origins to its much more humble use as a utilitarian way to get a full meal within something that you could eat with just your hands. So how did the pasty make it from Cornwall to Colorado? Well, in the 1860s, two things happened. One here in Colorado and one over in Cornwall. Over in Cornwall, thousands of tin miners were laid off during a depression in the tin market. At the same time, Colorado was beginning to better understand the rock that miners were trying to quarry through as engineers began to study out solutions for how to figure out how to get through that stone and get to the precious minerals that they wanted. So we had kind of a perfect situation where all those Cornish miners who knew how to work with the kind of rocks and stones that we have here were laid off, and we needed the kind of people that had that expertise to be able to push through it. So thousands of Cornish miners and their families immigrated to Colorado in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. So that by the 1880s and 1890s, 1 in 4 Gilpin County residents were Cornish or of Cornish descent. The new Coloradans brought with them their traditions, which of course included their food culture. So the pasty migrated from Cornwall to Colorado. It worked just as well here as it did over there. It made a nice hot meal in the middle of the day. We have a Cornish lunchbox along with an inedible Cornish pasty at History Colorado in our mine that's found in Colorado Stories. The lunchbox, as you can see pictured here, had a small spot for a candle so that the candle could heat up the pasty for a hot midday meal. The traditional filling for a Cornish pasty was a bit different from what the English lords and ladies were eating. While they were eating venison, eel, and other exotic ingredients, the Cornish pasty primarily consisted of potato, onion, and leeks, which is the traditional recipe. When the pocket would be baked, the vegetables would come together to form a gravy, and it would be a nice, warm, filling meal for midday for those miners. The Cornish pasty, the pastry of the Cornish pasty, is different from a traditional American pie crust in that it's a hot water crust pastry. Now what that means is that instead of cold or room temperature water or other liquid like you would use in an American pie crust, you use hot water. This pastry is more durable. It's easier to eat with your hands. And in fact, legend has it that pasties could be dropped down a mine shaft and still be okay at the end when they landed. So today we're going to make a hot water crust pastry for our Cornish pasty. So let's get started. The first step is assembling your ingredients. We'll start off with 3/4 cup of solid fat. Traditionally, pasties were made with lard, which is a rendered pork fat. However, today I'm substituting room temperature butter. I like my butter to be at room temperature before I make this recipe. And with butter, you need 12 tablespoons or 1.5 sticks. You can also use vegetable shortening. You just need 3/4 of a cup. The next thing is the flour. And with the flour, you want 1 1/4 cups. That, if you are using a scale, is 250 grams of wheat flour. This is definitely a gluten-intensive recipe. There are gluten-free recipes for Cornish pasty crust out there. You'll just want to look for something that has a hot water crust pastry. We also are going to need a pinch of salt. I like kosher, but really any kind of salt is fine. For those of you who like to measure things out, a pinch of salt is normally around 1/16 of a teaspoon. And finally, at the end, we're going to add in 1/4 cup of hot water. Okay, so let's get started putting our ingredients together. I like to have my flour in the bowl, and then I've got my butter ready to go, and I just put that in there. I like to kind of stir it around a little bit just to get some of the butter encrusted with the flour. If you have a pastry blender, this is the time where you can get that out. I washed my hands. I prefer to just do it with my hands. So I'm just going in there and I'm just kind of squishing up the butter, mixing it with the flour. You want to get the butter coated in the flour. And basically what you want to do, you can just kind of rub it together like you're rubbing soil off of your hands or starting the first part of your 20 seconds of hand washing. What you want to do is you want to get your butter into pea-sized balls. They don't have to be perfect little balls. They don't have to be pea-sized. The idea is that we're getting all of the butter as thoroughly coated in flour as we can. In the meantime, while I'm doing this, I already have my hot water heating up, bringing that to a boil so that I can prepare to put that in once I'm ready. I'm just kind of mixing this all up, rolling it around in my hands. Like I said, you can use a pastry blender if you have one, but it's definitely not a necessary tool in the kitchen. I've been making pie since I was 2. I have a Polaroid of me sitting on a counter with a rolling pin the same size as me trying to roll out my first crust. Don't need any fancy tools really to do this. So basically what you want to do is you want to look for something that looks like this. It's like got a nice crumb to it. You don't see any large chunks left in the bowl. Now before I put the hot water in, I'm going to get all the rest of this flour and butter off of my hands because I don't want any of that to go to waste. I'm just going to take my pinch of salt, put that in, give it just one more final toss, and I'm going to go over and grab my hot water. Just a 1/4 cup will do. You don't need a lot of water. And then just pour that in. If you have hands of steel, you can go ahead and start mixing right away. If you want to start mixing right away and you don't have hands of steel, you can start with a wooden spatula and just kind of start bringing that together. And you'll see right away it's starting to stick to itself. You're starting to get a nice sticky pastry that's going to start balling up for you right away. And you just want to mix that around. You want to make sure, I like to take it and smush it up against the side of the bowl. That really helps get all those extra little pieces that are in the bottom of the bowl stuck to the dough. Now this dough is not going to look done. If you're used to making a standard American pie crust, this dough is going to look super wet. You can see it's just got like a real wet sheen to it. And normally, if we were making a pie crust for a pie, we would want to add more flour into that. But we don't need to here because this is a hot water crust pastry. And we want it to be kind of that sticky, soft, but you can see it's all in a ball. It's not, You know, it's pretty easy to handle at the moment, but it's not ready for us to roll out. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave that sit in the bowl, and we want it to be room temperature, which really doesn't take too long, but you don't want it to be super warm because we need to be able to roll it out with, and we don't want to add too much extra flour to it when we roll it out. So we're going to leave it there for right now. I'm going to get my hands washed up so we can get started on the next part of this. But at home, if you're doing this, you want to leave long enough for a pause to let that cool to room temperature. Okay, so while we're waiting for our pastry to come to room temperature, let's talk about fillings. Without offending the traditionalists, there's almost nothing that you can't put in a pasty. But there are 3 basic rules that you want to follow to get a good filling. The first of all is you want things to be cut into small pieces. That's because pasties themselves aren't that large. Remember, they're handheld. The second is that you don't want anything too wet or soggy because that will make your crust soggy, and nobody wants a soggy crust. And the third thing is that when you make your ingredients in your filling, you want to blend them together really well so that you get a little bit of every single flavor in every single bite. Once you've got those 3 basic rules down, small bites, not too liquidy, well blended, you can really do almost anything. That's why this is such a great recipe for right now, because this is a great vehicle for leftovers. If you have leftover macaroni and cheese, you have leftover tater tot casserole, you have leftover pot roast, you have leftover almost anything, you can put it inside of a pasty. Just chop it up into little pieces, mix it up so that you get a little flavor in every bite, and then fill your pasties with them. The other great thing is that they freeze really well. So if you don't want to let those leftovers go to waste, but you cannot face another day of eating macaroni and cheese, put them into a pasty, bake them, wait for them to come to room temperature, wrap them up in a little piece of foil, put a label on the outside that says what it is, and chuck them in the freezer. When you're done, when you're ready to eat them again, pull them out. You can let them defrost in the fridge, or you can defrost them with your microwave settings. You can reheat in the microwave, or you can reheat in the oven. Either way works really well with pasties. And so you can use the leftovers that way. So an example of something I did is I had a bunch of leftover root vegetables a couple weeks ago. And so I turned them into I turned them into a curry pocket. So I just chopped up my parsnips and my potatoes and my sweet potatoes and my carrots, threw in a little bit of sauteed onion and some curry powder, mixed it all together, filled my pockets, baked them. Once they cooled, put them in the freezer. I just pulled this one out yesterday. It's got a nice filling to it, and I'm not going to be sick of something that I ate a whole bunch of times a couple of weeks ago. So they're really great for repurposing leftovers. So remembering our 3 rules, small pieces, not liquidy, well blended. Today I'm going to show you how to make an apple pie pasty. Okay, time to assemble the ingredients for our apple pie pasty. You're going to need 2 cups of apples. For me, that equated to 2 apples. You need 1 tablespoon of lime or lemon juice. You need 1.5 cups of water, 1/3 cup granulated sugar, 2 tablespoons cornstarch, 1/2 teaspoon of cinnamon or cardamom, a pinch of salt, 1/8 teaspoon of nutmeg, 1/8 teaspoon allspice, a grind of pepper, and our optional ingredients are a few tablespoons of raisins, and also a couple tablespoons of pear brandy, if you'd like. So let's go ahead and put all of this together. So I already cut up my apples. I like to leave the peel on mine, but if you don't like it, just take it off before you cut it up into pieces. What you want to do is you want to take your lemon juice or your lime juice, and you want to toss it with your apples, and then just put your apples in the bowl. And what that does is that keeps your apples from turning brown. So if you don't have it, don't worry about it. You can still make this recipe. It's not absolutely necessary. But I cut these about 10 minutes ago, and they're not brown yet because I tossed them in a little bit of the lime juice that I had. So we have our apples. Those are ready to go. And you want to take your cornstarch and your spices and your sugar and mix them all together so that they're all blended up. Now, if you happen to not have one of those spices that I mentioned, that's fine. What you need is about 1 teaspoon total worth of spices. And really anything goes. I use cardamom rather than cinnamon because that's a flavor that I like. But you can really use anything that you have in your cupboard that goes well together like this. So you could use cinnamon, cardamom, nutmeg, ginger. You could use pumpkin pie spice if you have that in your cupboard left over from last fall. So you really can use lots of different apple-y type flavors. If you don't have apples but you have pears, you can do the exact same ingredient. I also have a couple of tablespoons of raisins waiting here. If you don't like raisins, don't put them in. I also have a couple of tablespoons of pear brandy that I'm going to add because I just like that as a flavor. But again, that's optional. So we have kind of our two optional things over here. There we go. And we have our apples, we have our cornstarch, sugar, and and spices together, and our water. So what we want to do is we want to actually take this mixture and put it into the water. And this is going to make the basis of our filling. And let's see if I can do this here. I'm going to go over and I'm going to put it on the stove. And I'm going to start that on high. And I just want to give that a good mix. And just make sure everything's blended together. So while that comes to, what we're going to do is I'm going to bring that to a boil, and then I'll be back with you. Okay, so I hear that I'm starting to get a boil on our mixture. And as soon as it comes to a boil, let it boil for about a minute. After that minute, put in your apples, put in your optional ingredients, and bring it to a simmer, and let it simmer for about 3 to 5 minutes. You want to stir pretty frequently during that so you don't get clumps from your cornstarch. And so let's do that, and I'll meet you back at the end. Okay, so my apples have been going like this for about 5 minutes. And you get this nice bubbly effect, which is what you want to have going for the whole 5 minutes. So with the apple pie filling, it does need to be cool before we put it in the pasties. So you can make it the day before if you want to. But now let's go ahead and roll out our dough. Now this recipe makes 6 pasties. So I'm just going to pull it out of my bowl. It should come out in like one easy piece. Now, the easiest way to do this is to just kind of flatten it out and divide it into 6 pieces. Because you can do the bowl method where you roll out one big sheet and turn a bowl upside down and cut around it to make perfect circles. However, I have found that when you get to the end, you always have to kind of smush all the pieces that left together at the end and push them back into one piece to get your last one, and I don't like to do that. So I'm just going to take this and they're not exactly even, but they're pretty close. I'll pull a little bit off of that one. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take each of these pieces and I'm going to roll them into a little ball. Let's put that where you can see it. And this will help me see which pieces are larger and which ones are smaller. So I can already tell this one's smaller, like that. So I'm going to take a little bit off. This one looks kind of big. So I'm going to take a little bit off of that one, roll that back into a ball, and there we have it. 6 basically even pieces. So I'm just going to put 5 of those out of the way, and we'll put one to the side here. And then I have a little bowl of flour, and I'm just going to take a little flour and sprinkle it on my countertop, little over the top, and just roll that out. Oops. The nice thing about this dough is it's really forgiving. Remember I told you that you can drop it down a mine shaft. And I realized that I forgot to flour my rolling pin here. So if it pops open like that, you can just squish it back into itself, and that's not going to hurt it. So just going to roll it into a circle as best I can. And then I'm going to take that like to use parchment paper in the kitchen. It's quite versatile. And I already have my cookie sheet with a piece of parchment paper on it for baking. So I'm just going to use that cookie sheet in the meantime to pile up these pasty crusts. And the thing is like I said, they will fall apart a little bit because of the type of crust that they are. And you can just squish them back together. So same thing again, flour on the surface. Flatten my crust there a little bit, get it floured. Flour on the rolling pin. Roll that gently out. It's a very forgiving pie crust dough, or crust dough, excuse me. And you want them all to be about the same size. So I'm gonna roll that one about the same size, and I'm gonna put it on that piece of parchment paper on the cookie sheet. And I'm gonna do the same with all 6 of those so that they're ready to go. Okay, so it's time to assemble our pasties and get them cooked. So you want to preheat your oven to 400 degrees. And while that's preheating, we can go ahead and get our pasties made. So we've got our crusts that are at room temperature. We have our cooled filling, and I have a parchment paper lined cookie sheet. So if you don't have parchment paper, you can just spray it with nonstick cooking spray. So that's not a problem. Now, I will point out that my mixture looks awfully more liquid than there are chunks of apples. So this is because the recipe that I gave you, I probably should have had a couple more apples in here. And so what I'm going to do, I don't want to let that filling go to waste, but I also don't have any more apples in my refrigerator. And I am not planning a grocery store trip for a couple of days. So what I'm going to do is when I go to put this together, I'm just going to focus on pulling the apples out, and I'll leave the extra mixture, and then when I get a couple more apples at the store, I can cook those down and throw them in there. I also have a plate with a piece of the parchment paper. Again, if you don't have parchment paper, you can just spray it down with non-stick cooking spray. The idea is that we want an assembly surface where once it's filled, the pasty isn't going to stick to the plate, and we'll be able to move it easily to the baking sheet. So with that, we'll get started. I'm using a large soup spoon, just a dinner spoon. I've washed my hands, of course. And I'm going to do 2 of those. Get some of that extra filling part out. I'm going to do 2 of those right in the middle. Just kind of push those in there. And then I've got a bowl of water, which I forgot to prep ahead of time. And I'm just going to stick my fingers in there and run it around the edge on half of it, just so that things will stick to the other side. And then we want to just push it over gently. You don't want to squish too hard because your fillings will pop out. So now we have this. Our filling is in a nice little pocket here. And now we have all this extra edge. So it doesn't need to be super fancy, but you just want to roll the edge over. If you're a super artistic person, I hope you do something fancy with your edge and then post pictures to us at History Colorado on social media to show us what you can do with the edge of your pasty. But I'm just going to do mine super simple and roll them up into a little half moon. Now, this is a really interesting thing. So why do we have such big edges? Why don't we fill it all the way to the edge and just like squish around the edge so that it stays closed, but we don't have this great big edge to it? Well, this is also because of the Cornish miners. So the Cornish miners were working with tin all day, and tin has arsenic naturally occurring where tin is found. And so if they would have eaten that food with their hands and then consumed what they were eating, their bodies would get arsenic and they would get sick. So what they did was they created these pasties with really large edges so that they had something to hold on to when it's cooked. So when it's cooked, they have something to hold on to, and then they would just throw the crust away when they were finished, and the crust is where all of the arsenic or the tin from their fingers would be stuck to, so that would help them from keeping their toxic levels down. So once you've filled this, you want to just gently pick it up and move it onto your cooking surface. And we'll do that with another one. So there's number 2. And again, we're using just about 2 tablespoons of filling in these. Put it right in the middle. And like I said, I needed more apples and I didn't have them, so I'm taking off a little bit of that liquid. Just gonna dip my fingers in the water, go around half, fold it over gently. Again, as you saw, that split open just a little bit. That's okay, we'll just squish it back together. And then we're just gonna push the edges down so we have that nice little pile in the middle with an edge that goes around the outside of that. And then we're just gonna roll our edges over. Again, not super fancy, but if you're a fancy edge person and you wanna let us know what those look like, share those with us on our social media on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook at History Colorado. We would love to see what those edges look like. And again, just gonna lift that up and gently move that onto the cooking sheet. I'm going to go ahead and do that with the other 4 so that we have a total of 6 pockets, and then I'll meet you back for putting them in the oven. Okay, so my oven timer just went off. My oven is now preheated to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Before I put them into the oven on the center rack, I'm going to do one more thing, and that is I'm going to make them look pretty. So I'm just going to crack an egg, scramble it up, add just a hint of water. It's like maybe a teaspoon of water just to thin it out a little bit. Now if you have a pastry brush, you can use your pastry brush to put these on. I don't actually have one with me at the moment, so I'm just going to use a folded up piece of paper towel. It works. And I'm just going to dab that on top of my pastries. If you're planning on eating the edge crust, what a friend of mine lovingly refers to as the pizza bone, or the pie bone, make sure you get those dabbed as well so that you get a nice color on that. Now, if you do not want to waste an egg doing this, don't. The egg wash basically just makes your pasties look pretty. So if you don't want to spare that egg, don't worry about it. So those are now taken care of. So those are in on the center rack. I'm going to cook them for 20 to 25 minutes, which basically means that I'm going to check back in 20 minutes and to see how they're doing. And if they're not ready, I'll let them go for another 5 minutes. And if they're ready, I'll pull them out. So I will catch you back when we pull them out of the oven. So they were done. So I pulled them out of the oven and they've got a nice brown finish to them. You can also tell that they're done if you tap the top and get that nice hollow thumping sound. Well, the pasties are out of the oven and I have worked really hard to let them get cool enough to be able to handle. That's probably the hardest part about making pasties, by the way, is letting them get cool enough that we can hold them to eat them. Because that's what they are, after all, is hand food. And so I hope that you have really enjoyed our historic table, taking you back through our archives to hear the stories of how Cornish miners and their families changed the way that we eat and changed the way that we have produced mining extracts and industries here in the state of Colorado for more than 100 years now. And I'm just going to break this open to show you what our inside of our pies look like. We have this wonderful apple filling. So thank you very much. Please take the time, if you make your pasties, to share with us at History Colorado on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Tell us what you put in your pasties, show us pictures, let us know what you did, and we hope to see you coming back to History Colorado in person again really soon. Stay safe, take care, My name is Rachel Beyer. I'm the John W. Emery Family Assistant Curator of Oral History at History Colorado, and this is the Historic Table.